he was willing to make the sacrifice to do what he believed was right.
He killed his cash cow because he believed that the cash cow was actually hurting the environment.
And when you stack that up against how most businesses operate today, that is just diametrically opposed to the way many corporations would approach a moment like that.
We have with us today David Gellis, one of my favorite journalists and an amazing author of Dirtbag Billionaire, which we're about to discuss today. I will say, David, I have been waiting for this book to be written for a very long time, so I'm glad you did it. I am a longtime Patagonia fan. I worked my way through college selling outdoor apparel, so I sold a ton of Patagonia, and then of course in my working world, I'm a lawyer that does good, and so all of the legal structuring piece of it was kind of fun to nerd out on as well. So and then of course I love to get out in nature as well. So it's really cool to read this book. I'm super excited to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. It was fun to write too, I'll tell you.
I bet, man. Okay, I want to start with a question that's been bugging me for the last little bit, which is I'm not sure that I'm pronouncing Yvon Chouinard's name correctly. How do you pronounce it? How do you say it?
Just like you did. You're doing great.
Yeah.
Yvon Chouinard.
Okay, cool. All right, great. Fantastic. I will say I loved digging into this book. Now, the last time we chatted, we were talking about Jack Welch, the man who broke capitalism. And I am curious, I'd love to hear your take on the difference between these two. Are these two foils to each other? Is there anything that's surprisingly same about these two people?
Well, in many ways, these couldn't be two more different CEOs. Jack Welch, of course, was the General Electric chief executive from 1981 to 2001, who Fortune magazine crowned manager of the century. He turned GE into the most valuable company on earth, and he became a billionaire himself just by sheer virtue of being a manager and restructuring GE's compensation to reward him for doing his job. Yvon Chouinard, by contrast, a rock climber and blacksmith who started hammering out his own climbing equipment in the 1950s, sort of accidentally started selling clothes, accidentally became an apparel maker, and never grew comfortable with the limelight, let alone really any attention. I mean, and we'll talk about that. This is a man who was never comfortable with his own role as the leader of a company, let alone a movement. And so the trajectories of the companies, of course, very different. GE was enormous, a conglomerate. Patagonia has deliberately restrained its growth over the years, and really even today is just a pretty core maker of outdoor gear and apparel. So, and then listen, of course, the most diametrical way these two leaders are approached is really in their approach, the way they have approached issues like how businesses are supposed to do good in society, what companies should do with the profits they earn, how a company ought to treat its workers. And on almost every front, they could not be two more different leaders. I will note one way in which perhaps they're similar, and that is the obsession with quality. Jack Welch instituted a number of policies at GE that were all designed to enhance or improve the quality of GE products and services. Yvon Chouinard similarly went on a multi-decade quest to try to make Patagonia goods and products as the best they could possibly be. Now, I would argue that the ways in which they went about those two things, even the ways they define quality, are very different. But that's my high-level overview of how those two stack up against each other.
Interesting. Yvon Chouinard calls himself a dirtbag, and I'm curious. Why don't you enlighten us as to what that means in Patagonia culture?
Yeah, some people see the word dirtbag and they automatically assume it's a negative, that I'm somehow insulting him. But Yvon Chouinard refers to himself as a dirtbag. Even to this day, that's the word that in many ways he sort of harkens back to when he thinks about how to define his own identity. And in the world of climbing, in the world of surfing and skiing, a dirtbag refers to someone who is so unenamored with materialism that they are content to sleep in the dirt. These are vagabond, itinerant, sometimes homeless, outdoorsmen, outdoorswomen who would rather sacrifice a paycheck than get further away from the outdoors. And that's been true his whole life. He was one of the original dirtbags, and he's still proud of it. In fact, when he first heard the title of this book, I heard through the grapevine that he wasn't too happy about it, not because of the word dirtbag, but because of the word billionaire.
That makes a ton of sense after reading the book, that would be the thing that he's offended about, whereas like the rest of the world might be offended by being called a dirtbag.
The feedback I got from his team was, well, he's not a billionaire anymore. And I said, well, of course he's not, but he gives it away in the subtitle. So you gotta understand the totality of the story.
And I love the title. You've got that tension there, and it tells a story in and of itself, and it even, and we'll dive into this a little bit later on, but dives in, kind of like pulls out the crux of the challenge of a company like Patagonia, which is that there's inherently a tension in trying to blend profit and purpose. I would like to ask you, taking back to a key decision that was made in the very early days of Chouinard equipment. And this was the move from pitons to hexes, right? And why don't you describe to us what that move was? And I would love your take on whether that was kind of a first decision that sent this company down a path that led them to a different place.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right to home in on that moment as one of the pivotal inflection points in this story. So what happened is in the early 60s or so, Yvon Chouinard and his pals were making rock climbing gear, and they were really hammering out pitons, word you just used. These are basically spikes with a hole at the end. Think about a big sewing needle, and they would hammer or screw these into the wall, affix a carabiner or rope, and use that to secure themselves as they went up these increasingly ambitious climbs that they were doing in Yosemite, multi-pitch, multi-day ascents up El Capitan. What Chouinard and his pals realized after several years of this was that as the sport was getting more popular, more and more people were using pitons, and the walls were getting damaged. They were getting pockmarked, and they were getting destroyed. This 10,000-year-old granite suddenly had all these little holes in it from them and their buddies in just a matter of years. And Chouinard realized that that was just unsustainable. They were going to destroy the very thing that they loved. And so he resolved on the spot, basically, to stop selling pitons. And he found new alternatives, chocks, hexes, other ways to secure himself and his gear to the wall without damaging it in such a severe way. But that moment, if you really slow down and think about it, pitons were like 90%. Please.
Yeah, the key innovation there is that these are removable and leave little to no trace, as opposed to the piton, which were removable but left a huge trace.
Yeah, and sometimes weren't removed.
Sometimes weren't removed.
Right.
Often, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely right. So yeah, these hexes and chocks and stoppers, different ways to hold the gear to the wall, they could be taken with him. And they called this new sort of style clean climbing, which I think is such a lovely phrase. But what they said was, right, it's not only in the way you climb the mountain, it's what state you leave the mountain in after it's done. And to them, that meant clean, and that meant leaving no trace. And that decision, when he made it, though, it jeopardized almost the entirety of his business. Pitons were basically everything he sold. And so when he made the decision to say, well, we're switching to chocks and hexes, that was essentially turning his back on his one key product. And it required sort of a leap of faith that he'd be able to figure something else out, or that nothing else would work out, but he was willing to make the sacrifice to do what he believed was right.
He killed his cash cow because he believed that the cash cow was actually hurting the environment. And made this pivot into a product that was unknown, untested. Nobody knew if this was going to take off or not.
And when you stack that up against how most businesses operate today, I don't need to belabor the point that that is just diametrically opposed to the way many corporations would approach a moment like that.
No consultant would recommend this.
Right. He did not get that decision from McKinsey.
McKinsey did not approved. I want to talk about, so fast forwarding really a couple decades from there to a moment that you describe as Black Wednesday. And I would love for you to kind of talk us through where Patagonia is in their life cycle leading up to Black Wednesday, what happened, and then what the impact of Black Wednesday was on the company going forward.
So we're in the late 80s at this point, and he's moved from a climbing gear business to really an apparel business. And they're doing real sales at this point. I don't remember the exact number, but we're into the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenues, selling, shorts and rain slickers and T-shirts. You got a fleece on right there.
This might not have been out yet, though. This was maybe on the horizon. I don't know.
I'm looking at that. Is that a better sweater?
It's the Chinchilla Snap Tee.
Chinchilla. Okay, so the Chinchilla. This was right around the time, probably just before Chinchilla hit the market. But what happened was that they were enjoying tremendous growth in the late 80s, and Chouinard had always deliberately restrained growth. He'd always been uncomfortable with the idea of this company getting too big. And so he never sold in department stores. They were judicious with their expansion plans. But by the late 80s, things were actually revving up. And they made the decision to hire a bunch of people that they projected they would need in the years ahead to meet what was at one point, 40% annual growth. Crazy. They made those hires. They started staffing up. They started scaling up the supply chain, and then all of a sudden, the economy takes a nosedive. Sales fall, and in a matter of months, weeks even, they go from a situation where it looks like they're positioned for 40% annual growth for the foreseeable to a place where they literally one day are not able to make payroll. And they, for the first time, have to institute mass layoffs across the company. And it's hundreds of people by this point. And it leaves a scar on the company. They survive. It gets close for a minute there. There's a flirtation with bankruptcy. They make it on a financial perspective. But that moment is still talked about in the company today. 30 plus years later, people are still looking back on that as a pivotal moment because it was one of those instances where something that happened really made an imprint on Chouinard, and he took away from it a couple lessons. Number one, he never wanted to be that exposed. Patagonia has always held really substantial cash reserves ever since then. Same thing, by the way, that happened with Steve Jobs and Apple after he returned. He had that flirtation with bankruptcy early in his career, never wanted that to happen again. He always had cash, piles of it, for Apple ever since. Look where they are now.
Yeah, lots of piles now.
Yeah, the other thing that Chouinard really understood was that he never wanted to have to do mass layoffs again. And as a result, that once again became part of the rationale for deliberately restraining the company's growth, never letting it feel like it wasn't in control. And that's led to, Patagonia, frankly, being a smaller company today than it might otherwise be.
Mm-hmm. Do I remember correctly? Did it also make them do some soul searching, add a board of directors, and start to ask themselves, what are we doing here? What is this thing all about?
Yeah, exactly right. Thank you for the close read. You're in there. We should do some Patagonia trivia. I'll see if I can stump you on anything.
All right, fair enough. Yeah.
That's exactly right. After Black Wednesday, once the dust settled, Yvon Chouinard sort of took his board and some core team on a trip to Patagonia, to the the area in Chile and Argentina known as Patagonia, and they really began thinking deeply about what it means to be in business. Yes, they did things like codify their own set of values. It's a document that's still referenced in the company today. But more than that, they had a series of conversations that I think made what was until that point implicit much more explicit, which is that Patagonia, they were going to be a clothing company. But at the end of the day, they were all there sort of trying to serve a higher purpose. They were trying to protect the environment. They were trying to show other businesses that there was a different way to do it. And those sort of revelations that came out of these conversations after Black Wednesday still shape the company's trajectory today.
You mentioned earlier when you were comparing Jack Welch and Yvon Chouinard, the quality matters to both of them. I loved how you were describing what and a couple times in the book, describing what a quality product is to Patagonia. Why don't you lay it out? What does quality mean to Patagonia?
I think it's been an evolution. And I think it's important to note that, early in his career, Chouinard was focused on quality. But at that point, I think he mostly meant functionality, right? Did this work? Was it a simplified version of whatever product he was looking for?
Did it hold up?
Did it hold up? Was it durable? Was it easy to use? Did it not have excessive complexity? That's one version of quality that I think is still very much intact as the company and Chouinard and his team think about what it means for Patagonia goods to be quality today. But over the years, there did emerge this more holistic understanding of quality. And the other components that they think about when they think about what is a quality item today include things like, are there any toxic materials in any of the components that we use to build this thing? What about the labor situation in the factory that made the finished good for us? If we're hiring this factory, are the people there being treated well? Is the factory a good corporate citizen, or is it like dropping toxic waste into a river in Portugal? They started asking these questions, and it wasn't all at once. It was an evolution, but that led to this much more holistic understanding of quality that in turn inspired all sorts of really radical practices at Patagonia, where they became a not only a leader for themselves, but also really an industry leader in trying to set the bar quite high for things like human rights, corporate social responsibility, pollution controls, and all that.
That leads me to a section of the book that I would entitle "Strange Bedfellows," and it's the relationship with Walmart, Patagonia and Walmart, and I thought that was so I knew a little bit of the story, but it was fun to kind of peel back the layers and hear how that all came together. Why don't you tell us about what their relationship was like and why it came about and what happened with it?
Strange bedfellows indeed. I mean, is there more of a David and Goliath pairing than little, at that point, substantially less than $1 billion a year revenue company in Patagonia staffed by a bunch of vagabond hippies and Walmart, in Bentonville? No, there was not, it could not have been a stranger pairing. And yet what happened was there was a consultant, a guy named Jim Ellison. He was looking to sort of build his consultant business. He can, through his connections, got in touch with Walmart, got them to agree to sort of let him try out some of his green consultancy magic on them. But he very quickly turned to Patagonia because he understood that it was one thing for him to say it. It was a whole different thing to be able to point to a company that was actually doing this already and being quite successful and profitable. And that then began a real relationship and dialogue between the two companies, so much so that Yvon Chouinard, if you can believe it, actually flew out to Bentonville, Arkansas, and spent the day there talking to Walmart employees. Meanwhile, Walmart executives were traveling to Ventura and sort of looking at these crazy hippies and trying to understand how they ran their business. And this went on for many years. In fact, the two companies came together and actually convened a larger group of retail companies to try to set a new benchmark standards for how they would evaluate sustainability claims. And at one point, the two companies actually considered making a product together. That didn't pan out. I think if it did, it would go for a lot of money on eBay. Totally. So they stopped short. And listen, I won't try to romanticize this. After the CEO who did a lot of that work, Lee Scott, resigned, the next CEO came in, had no patience for any of it. Walmart sort of reverted back to its usual ways. And that's why when I asked Yvon Chouinard about this experience and asked him why he thought it was worth it, what he thought it had accomplished, he said, listen, if there was even a small chance that it might have changed the trajectory of a giant aircraft carrier like Walmart, it was probably worth the effort. But the ultimate result, the fact that they didn't really move the needle that much, shows to him that public companies, in his estimation, are hopeless. Right? I don't personally hold that conviction, but in his mind, if you're at the whims of quarterly earnings, it's already too late to be sort of a righteous corporate actor.
Yeah, that's interesting. They have Walmart, to their credit, has made a lot of great moves, but I think that the way that you summed it up was really interesting, which is they picked the lowest hanging fruit, and that actually was meaningful. Whenever you do that at the scale of what Walmart's doing, it matters, but but they stop short of kind of like thinking too much deeper. The one surprise for me in this book was I did not know that that Berkshire Hathaway considered purchasing or made an offer to purchase Patagonia. I'd love to hear that story. It was basically like a paragraph or two in the book, but we'll love to hear how that came about and why it was turned down. In some ways, I like knowing about Buffett. It's like if you're going to be bought, like he's probably the guy you want to buy you. But it probably obviously didn't still achieve the objective, but would love to hear your take on that possible transaction. Yeah.
So I don't know a whole lot about it. I got bits and pieces of this over the year, but Yvon himself told me. And yeah, it was, and talks never went super far, but I think this was sort of routine M&A exploratory work. You have to remember, Berkshire Hathaway owns Fruit of the Loom. They know their way around apparel. And so I think there was a point, it was in the mid 90s, I believe, that Berkshire, and I don't think it was Buffett calling Chouinard one-on-one, but I think the corporate teams, there was dialogue. But here, I think it's important to note, setting aside who the potential acquirer would have been, the fact that Chouinard wouldn't even sell to Warren Buffett says a lot about what he believed that he needed to do with Patagonia and how he wanted to run this company. And there's different ways to sort of describe it. One would be that he really believed that it was incumbent upon him and his team to keep the company sort of as pure as it could possibly be. The flip side of that coin is that he didn't trust anyone else. And I think that's an important part of this as well. He didn't trust Berkshire Hathaway. He didn't trust public shareholders. He didn't trust his own employees to manage the company in the long term, for the long term.
Yeah, and maybe we'll get into a little bit more of that last piece, because it did seem for as admirable of a person as he is, it seems like he's a tough guy to work for, and that there's a lot of contradictions, and maybe I think it's summed up best. Like my favorite paragraph of the book is this paragraph I'm going to read to you, and I love your kind of like take back on this. Okay. While Patagonia is in so many ways an extraordinary company, independent, idealistic, successful, generous, it was still fraught with fundamentally irresolvable tensions. Chouinard wanted his workers to be happy, but he was also hard charging. He wanted to be generous, but he also wanted to stay in control. He wanted Patagonia to be lean, but also abundant. He wanted the company to be profitable, but also charitable. He wanted a small business with a big impact. In trying to run a responsible company, Chouinard had created an unsolvable paradox. Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's like, it is a very dense paragraph, but I'd love you to talk about any of those tensions that you think are interesting to pull the thread on.
Yeah, you have homed in on what I sort of think is the through line of the whole book. Those tensions, these paradoxes, these contradictions, they start early in his life personally, and they continue to this day, given the new ownership structure of the company and all of the ways in which it is a very different place than it started out. And I think it starts at the very earliest level. I mean, with the piton example we talked about. Here he was making a product that suddenly he realized was harming the planet. Those two things, right away, he could see that actually just being in business was taking a toll. That continues all the way through, right? We talked about some of the supply chain issues, but in instance after instance, Patagonia has done the difficult work of sort of turning the mirror on itself, looking for its own perfections, looking for ways in which it's not living up to its own standards, and then trying to do the work to get better. And just in that work, they are acknowledging their own hypocrisy, right? Because many companies would simply either just turn a blind eye or say, we'll get to it when we can. But we're not going to jeopardize our business lines. We're not going to admit that we might make fewer profits in a quarter or a year because of it. So that runs all the way through. There's the tension between running a apparel company and telling people to buy less, right?
Yeah.
This has been a through line of their marketing. They always, they ran famously the "Don't buy this jacket" ad in 2015, but more broadly, they're always, they're promoting worn wear and promoting recycled clothing, and yet the business doesn't survive if people don't buy new Patagonia gear all the time. Yeah. How do you square that circle? Well, you don't. And in, time and time again, I could go through the list, but you nailed it. That is the paradox. And I think the important thing that I arrived at in thinking about the book is that it's unresolvable and it doesn't need to be resolved. Yeah. And that's okay. That's actually the story.
Yeah. I think that our hunger, maybe as business leaders, as just readers, is we would love there to be the clean answer, Mm-hmm. And it's so clear that this stuff is hard. I want to get into succession planning and legal structures. I really enjoyed the breakdown. I read a lot about this when it happened, and love to hear kind of the behind the scenes and blow by blow. I guess to frame it, all of the potential normal options that you'd take in this case were off the table because they didn't achieve the objectives of the team. And will you kind of lay out the objectives for us, and then maybe why this structure that they landed on actually achieved what they were actually set out to do?
Yeah. Well, just to sort of set the stage, we're now only 5 or so years ago. Patagonia mm-hmm. is a $1 billion revenue company with a equity value of somewhere between $3 and $6 billion. Yvon Chouinard is placed on the Forbes list of billionaires for the first time in 2017, and he goes apoplectic. He says it's one of the worst days of his life. Yeah. He's so pissed. He says, "Get me off this list." Yeah. Nothing happens for a couple years. But then in 2021, he goes to the new CEO at the time, Ryan Gellert, and he says, "I'm serious. You figure out how to get me off this list, or I'm going to call people on the Forbes list, and I'm going to start offering to sell the company." And Ryan, who had just started as CEO, sort of figures out that Chouinard is being serious. Yeah. And so he's like, "Okay, let's figure it out." A team is put together, some internal, some external, and they try out every different option, right? They figure out, is an IPO going to work? Is a sale going to work? Is private equity going to work? And the answer was always no, because, as you said, Chouinard and his family wanted to optimize for 3 sort of contradictory outcomes. They wanted the company to survive. Patagonia had made it 50 years. It deserved the chance to make it another 50 years. There were a lot of employees that were going to lay everyone off and shut the place down. So the company sort of had to survive more or less as the same company it was. That meant preserving some measure of independence, making sure those values stayed intact. Next thing they wanted was to genuinely divest Chouinard and his family of their ownership of the shares, which is what made them billionaires on paper. That meant actually getting that equity out of their possession and into the hands of someone else. That was the big question. A couple other things they were trying to optimize for. They didn't want to make a foundation with their name on it. They, as I said earlier, were shy people, and they were not looking to step into the limelight here. Last thing they wanted to do was make sure that as much money as possible was going toward the causes that Chouinard and his family cared most about: conservation and environmental activism. Mm-hmm. With that, it took years, but they finally figured out a structure that remarkably seems to accomplish all of those goals. And in 2022, they approached me and asked me to break the news in the New York Times. And that's what I did. So I broke the news in the New York Times.
That's a cool story to break.
Biggest story I've ever written, millions and millions and millions of page views. And it was right after that I decided to write the book. And we could go more into the structure itself if you want, but I just needed to catch my breath.
Yeah, no, totally. So the structure ends up being a really interesting setup where you have a purpose trust that holds 2% of the company that has the voting shares. And then there's the Holdfast Collective, which is a 501c4 that holds 98% of the shares that are non-voting. And so how did we end up to that structure?
Well, you nailed it. It's so fun to talk to a super informed conversation partner, because usually I'm the one that has to explain that. And it's like, oh, Kyle totally, of course, gets it.
Yeah.
That was a structure that was devised by a guy named Dan Mosley, who's a partner at BDT, which is, the private bank run by Byron Trott, most famously known as Warren Buffett's banker. And what he was brought in relatively late to the process, but once he understood these competing priorities, he said, oh, a purpose trust might let us do this. And so you nailed it. They put that 2% of voting shares in a purpose trust. That purpose trust effectively serves as like an additional board layer for the C Corp Patagonia in California, still a for-profit C Corp in Patagonia. But they have this additional governance layer.
No, they're a benefit corporation in California, are they not?
Well, yes, you are right. They are a benefit corporation. Most people, yes. Well corrected. But they are a for-profit California corporation.
That's right.
And then they have this additional governance layer, and that governance layer instructs them to distribute all of the profits that are not reinvested in the company. So they still have plenty to pay people, still have plenty for R&D, but anything that doesn't go back into the company is distributed to the Holdfast Collective, this constellation of 501c4s that, yes, are also the holders of the 98% of the non-voting shares. And then they get the money and they distribute it on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, they get a dividend every year, every quarter, however they do it, right? And that's their fund to go out. And from a tax perspective, it was really interesting that they did not get if they had set up a 501c3, they would have had a really sweet tax setup personally, but they decided to do the C4 because they wanted to have the ability to also do political activism, or at least have that as an option. And there was a pretty big tax hit on them for not doing it to the 501c3.
Yeah. And some people accuse them, right? There's a lot of chatter, right, when this happened, that this was a big game to sort of minimize their tax bill and skirt the IRS. And listen, like people are entitled to their opinions, but I think what's important to realize is that when you pay capital gains tax or when you pay an inheritance tax, there is the transaction of, in the case of a capital gains tax, a monetary profit for the sale of equity in this case. Right. That never happened. So there were no taxes for them to pay. And in the sale of an inheritance, the children would have acquired an asset which they could have then sold for a huge amount of money, but that didn't happen either. And so it is true, no doubt about it. Yes, they avoided paying taxes, but they also renounced the very thing that gave them their net worth. And that nuance has been hard for some people to appreciate.
Yeah, it's like, yes, they didn't pay taxes. They also didn't make any money off the transaction. So
correct.
The other day, my wife was bringing in the mail to me, and she lays down this cover of Fast Company, How Business for Good Went Bad, which is currently on the newsstands right now. And so I as somebody that's been a part of the movement and been a big follower of the movement, and we even wrote a book on this idea myself. Like, I am curious what your thoughts are, or what your response to critics that say this business for good stuff doesn't really work, and it might be the folks on the left that say it's just a bunch of greenwashing and it doesn't matter anyways, or the folks on the right that would just say this is like a bunch of woke BS.
What if they're both right? Let's just rewind to my own work 8 years ago. 8 years ago, I was the guy at the New York Times who was tasked with covering the corporate community's response to President Trump's first term. My bread and butter for years, I was writing the corner office column. I was covering CEOs. It was all about what are CEOs saying when President Trump, in the first months of his first term, started doing like sort of outrageous things. Right? Whether it was the Muslim ban or his remarks after Charlottesville, they were all, each one of these became this flashpoint. the corporate community at that point stood up in unison and spoke out against the president. They disbanded the CEO advisory councils, and one CEO after another stood up and said, "This is un-American. We don't believe in this." Fast forward to today, and you have many of those same CEOs sitting at the table with him at the White House, as this administration arguably takes much more extreme actions across a number of fronts. So when I see covers like that, I'm not at all surprised, right? The Business Roundtable statement in 2019, I believe it was, that they were redefining the purpose of a corporation to be more than just about shareholder value. They were going to take care of their workers and society now. Who references that today? I don't hear a word about it. And the BRT, every day I get their emails in my inbox talking about how great President Trump's latest tax cuts are. So right. I think the critics are justified to be skeptical, you could say. And I would point out that there are few and far between the companies that are actually still speaking out. But want to know which is one of them? This one, Patagonia, is one of the few, honestly, one of the truly few for-profit corporations that is out there unabashedly saying what they think. And the CEO, Ryan Gellert, Chouinard himself is 86 now. He sort of, pays as little attention to the news as he possibly can. He always is fishing. But Ryan Gellert, happy to talk about it. And he goes off every week about the latest actions by this administration, especially on issues like nature and climate, which, as of my day job, I'm reporting, this administration has just been taking a chainsaw to climate action in this country.
Was this just a pipe dream then of the early 2000s? This idea that business could be a vehicle for goods? Or was there a hype cycle that has now popped? What's your read? Is anybody surviving on the other side? Has
my concern is that we draw too black and white of lessons from a moment like this. Listen, there are reasons why CEOs are sitting down with the Trump administration. It's because he's shown the willingness to be vindictive and to penalize companies that don't cooperate. And when a CEO is accountable to their public shareholders, well, you can bet that they're going to think twice about crossing the president in this kind of an environment. I also think it's important to note that while the political winds have shifted a ton, I would argue that on balance, corporate America is a environment today that is taking more seriously issues like employee well-being, sustainability, general, I can't go too broad here, but on a number of fronts, I would say supply chain management, right? Toxic chemicals. I think inevitably corporate America has made a lot of progress on a lot of issues. So it's a complicated answer, right? It is not the case that corporate America was ever going to magically snap its fingers and emulate Patagonia wholeheartedly. We saw that with Wal-Mart. But while, listen, I think people have a right to be very skeptical of a lot of statements CEOs made and are making to this day, I also don't want to lose sight of the fact that in a number of areas, there has been real progress. And I'll point to just one before I sort of completely expire, which is childcare, right? Patagonia was a leader in this. In 1973, the company was founded. Just a couple of years later, Yvon's wife, Melinda Chouinard, starts investing heavily in childcare. Fast forward to today, many corporations. I was just at KKR the other day. They were bragging to me about the fact that they now pay mothers who are nursing to travel with a companion so that they can still nurse their children when they're on work trips. That's the kind of thing that I don't know if KKR would be doing today if Patagonia hadn't started doing it back in the 70s.
I loved the little snippets throughout the book that was we were fly fishing in the river or we were surfing. I have to imagine that research trip, or was it trips, was not hard. I mean, it was good work. That's the type of work that you want to be doing.
There were some pinch me moments as a reporter on this trip. You know, like I've been a reporter my whole career, basically, and I've spent plenty of time in corporate boardrooms. I've been inside jails. I've been inside boring office complexes. You know, for this book, I got to go fishing on the Snake River in Wyoming. I got to go ski touring in Highlight Canyon in Montana. I got to go surfing at Punta de Lobos, Chile. I got to go hiking at Fitzroy in Argentina. So it was an extraordinary reporting experience, not only for the opportunity to go to those remarkable places that inspired this company and inspired this man and his life story, but also to spend time with him. You know, we spent a good amount of time together over the last few years, and you know, he's still a reclusive man, and at times not the most forthcoming interviewee, and yet just being around him, just watching him fish, watching how he moves through the natural world, you can learn a whole lot.
David, hey, appreciate your time and really appreciate the work you put into this. It was just such a pleasure to read, and I know that everybody that picks this up is going to love it.
Thank you so much for having me, Kyle.
Thanks so much.
It's always great to talk to you.